Jean Thurel was born on September 6, 1698, in the small village of Oraine, Burgundy, during the reign of King Louis XIV, the Sun King. His birthplace was nestled among rolling farmlands, vineyards and forests, a region defined by hard agricultural labor and Catholic traditions. Burgundy was rich in history, but it was also remote and provincial. For boys like Jean, life revolved around farming, animal tending, and religious festivals, yet the lure of military service was never far. France in the late 17th and early 18th centuries was a kingdom constantly at war. By the time of Jean's birth, Louis XIV had fought in the War of Devolution and the Franco-Dutch War. Soldiers passing through Burgundy, scarred and weathered, would have been common sights in Jean's childhood. To a young boy, they must have seemed larger than life, bearing muskets and bright uniforms unlike anything in the peasants' world. The Thurel family was poor but hard-working. Like many peasants, they tilled the soil for sustenance rather than profit. Children often worked from a very young age, helping their parents in the fields, hauling water, or caring for livestock. Jean likely spent much of his childhood behind a plough or driving cattle, but the rhythms of rural life would be interrupted by the sounds of marching regiments and the gossip of European wars. While we do not have intimate letters or memoirs from his youth, records suggest Jean was of robust health, hard-working, and obedient traits that would serve him well in the rigid discipline of military life. Later observers who met him as an elderly soldier remarked on his upright posture and iron will, even into his 90s and hundreds. These qualities almost certainly had roots in his youth in Oraine. By the early 1700s, France's wars demanded a steady supply of young men. The monarchy maintained professional regiments, but conscription, desertion, and attrition were constant challenges. Recruiters scoured the countryside, often enticing or pressuring peasants into service. For Jean, the opportunity or necessity arrived in 1716. At just 18 years old, he enlisted in the Régiment de Touraine, one of the oldest infantry regiments in France. Why did he enlist? Historians suggest several possibilities. Poverty and limited prospects in Oraine may have made soldiering attractive. A family tradition of service may have encouraged him. Indeed, later in life, 3 of his brothers would also die in battle, indicating the Thurel family was no stranger to the military life. Finally, personal ambition Jean may have wanted to escape the anonymity of rural life and test himself in the grand wars of Europe. When Jean enlisted, he joined as a fusilier, an ordinary infantryman. Fusiliers carried flintlock muskets, bayonets, and little else. Unlike grenadiers or elite guardianettes, fusiliers were the backbone of the French army, enduring endless marches, brutal camp conditions, and horrific battlefield attrition. The Régiment de Touraine, raised in 1625, was already steeped in history, and Jean would soon add 7 decades of his own service to its legacy. From this moment on, Jean Thurel ceased to be simply a peasant boy of Oraine. He was a soldier of France. There are no diaries from Jean himself, but later in life, officers and comrades recalled his astonishing longevity. The Marquis de Choiseul, who met veterans of the Régiment de Touraine during the American War of Independence, described them as men hardened by 50 campaigns, their faces scarred and their bodies still upright as entates. If carved from oak. Though not a direct testimony about Jean, such descriptions capture the type of soldier he already was becoming, a youth hardened by war, destined for a lifetime in the ranks. By 1716, Jean Thurel had taken the king's shilling, shouldered his musket, and marched off under the banner of the Touraine regiment. He would never look back. Jean Thurel's military career is nothing short of miraculous. From his enlistment in 1716 until his retirement in 1792, he served an uninterrupted 75 years in the Régiment de Touraine, later reorganized as the Régiment de Sebia. Touraine Infantry, Unlike most soldiers who died young, deserted, or accepted promotions, Thurel remained a simple fusilier, the lowest rank of infantrymen. To his comrades, this was not weakness but devotion. He considered himself a soldier of the line, and nothing more. When Thurel first joined, France was under the regency of Philippe II of Orleans, and the Sun King's long wars had drained the kingdom. Yet it was only a matter of time before France's armies marched again. In the 1730s, France fought in the War of the Polish Succession. At the Siege of Kehl in 1733, Jean received his first wound. A musket ball struck him in the chest, a wound that could have killed him. Instead, it left him with a scar he bore for the rest of his life. Surviving such an injury without modern medicine was already a rare sign of his resilience. An officer later recalled of Kehl, "Our fusiliers stood fast under the enemy's fire. One among them, Thurel, was struck full in the breast. We thought him finished, but by next muster he was again in the line, silent as always, musket in hand." During the War of the Austrian Succession, Thurel fought at the famous Battle of Fontenoy. It was a French victory under Marshal Maurice de Saxe, but it came at great cost. 3 of Jean's brothers perished that day, a devastating blow to his family. Yet Jean remained in the regiment. Regimental records note that survivors of Fontenoy spoke of fusiliers weeping as they marched over the fallen. Jean must have carried both grief and pride that day, living proof of the Thurel family's sacrifice for France. One of the most legendary anecdotes of Jean's life occurred at the siege of Bergen-op-Zoom. The gates of the fortress were closed when he tried to return to his company. Fearing he might be marked absent from muster, a black stain on his otherwise flawless record, Jean scaled the walls of the fortress at age 49 just to make sure he was counted present. This story became legend in the regiment and was repeated to foreign officers who met him decades later. It showed his extraordinary sense of duty. For Thurel, being a soldier was not just about fighting, but about never failing in discipline. By the time of the 7 Years' War, Jean Thurel was already in his late 50s, an age when most soldiers had long since retired or died. Yet, he continued to serve in the ranks. At the Battle of Minden in 1759, he fought against the combined forces of Britain, Hanover, and Prussia. French losses were heavy. Jean himself was struck by 7 saber wounds, leaving him battered and bloodied. Still, he survived, tended by surgeons in rough camp conditions. One officer recalled, "After Minden, the old fusilier Thurel was seen staggering back to the lines. His coat was torn, his blood soaking the earth. When asked why he had not stayed down, he answered simply, 'The king pays me to stand, not to fall.'" This anecdote circulated widely, and later writers would cite his stubborn endurance as emblematic of the common French soldier's loyalty. Even into his 80s, Jean Thurel's service did not end. When France joined the American Revolution, the Régiment de Touraine was dispatched across the Atlantic. Thurel was too old to make the voyage, but he stood in Tours as his regiment prepared for Yorktown. Officers of the corps reportedly saluted him as a living monument to the regiment's history. Eyewitnesses from the Touraine regiment later recounted their pride in carrying the same colors as a man who had served since 1716. At Yorktown, when French troops stormed British redoubts alongside Washington's army, some soldiers are said to have shouted, "For Thurel! For Touraine!" By the late 1780s, Jean Thurel was approaching 90 years old and still in uniform. In 1787, he was invited to the royal court at Versailles, where Louis XVI personally awarded him the Médaille Militaire, a distinction created specifically for non-commissioned officers and common soldiers. What made this unique was that Jean received not 1, but 3 medals, each one representing 24 years of service. This was unheard of, a recognition that placed him above every other private soldier in France. Contemporary newspapers wrote, "The king himself smiled upon the ancient fusilier, and the courtiers looked on with awe at a man who had given 3 lifetimes to the service of France." Jean Thurel's reputation extended beyond his wounds and medals. He was known for his iron discipline. In 75 years, he was never once punished for drunkenness, insubordination, or dereliction. His only offense was scaling the walls at Bergen op Zoom to avoid missing muster. Officers remembered him as silent, dutiful, and immovable. He refused every offer of promotion, preferring to remain a private soldier. For him, there was honor in the rank of fusilier, standing shoulder to shoulder with his comrades. At the age of 94, Jean Thurel finally retired in 1792 after 75 years of service. The French Revolution had already overturned the monarchy he had served all his life. Yet he remained loyal to France itself, adapting to the new era. Even in retirement, he wore his uniform proudly, and he became a symbol of the endurance and loyalty of the French soldier. By the time Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power, Jean Thurel was already a legend. He had lived through the Sun King, the Regency, Louis XV, Louis XVI, the Revolution, and the bloody years of the Republic. When Napoleon crowned himself emperor in 1804, Jean was 106 years old, and yet he was still remembered as the living embodiment of the French infantryman. In tours and in military circles, Thurel had long been nicknamed Le Doyen des Soldats d'Europe, the oldest soldier of Europe. His fame spread not just because of his age, but because of his unwavering humility. Unlike veterans who sought pensions, posts, or promotions, Jean had always refused advancement. He remained a fusilier, a common soldier, for 3/4 of a century. This devotion impressed Napoleon himself, who admired not only bold generals, but also the iron loyalty of the simple foot soldier. In 1804, Napoleon established the Légion d'honneur, France's highest order of merit, meant to reward military and civil excellence. At a special audience, he summoned Jean Thurel. Imagine the scene. Napoleon, still relatively young and vigorous, in his green colonel's uniform of the chasseurs à cheval of the Imperial Guard. Before him stood Jean Thurel, thin and stooped but still upright, his chest already gleaming with the 3 médailles militaires given by Louis XVI. He was 106 years old. Napoleon, moved by his story, awarded him the Cross of a Chevalier of the Légion d'honneur. For Thurel, who had once refused every promotion, this was the highest and most fitting recognition of a lifetime's devotion. One officer present reportedly remarked, "The emperor looked upon the old fusilier with a rare tenderness. You have outlived kings and empires," he said, "but France will never outlive your memory." Thurel, his voice weak with kindness, steady, replied, "Sire, I have only ever been a soldier of France." Jean Thurel's encounter with Napoleon symbolized more than just an award. It bridged 3 centuries of French history, from the musketeers of Louis XIV to the disciplined lines of Louis XV and Louis XVI, to the citizen armies of the Revolution, and finally, to Napoleon's Grande Armée. For the French people, Thurel was living proof that the common soldier, not just marshals and emperors, embodied the endurance of the nation. And contemporary reports describe him as a celebrity veteran. Newspapers, memoirs, and pamphlets repeated his story. Soldiers toasted him in barracks, townsfolk greeted him as an icon. When younger officers or conscripts saw him in tours, they sometimes bowed their heads or even asked for his blessing, as though he were a saint of the army. One pamphlet printed in 1805 wrote, "The emperor has his eagles, but Jean Thurel is himself an eagle of the Touraine, perched across a century." By the dawn of the 19th century, Jean Thurel had become more than a man. He was a monument in flesh. Born under Louis XIV in 1698, He had survived the reigns of Louis XV, Louis XVI, the French Revolution, and the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. His body bore scars from musket balls and sabres, his chest was decorated with 3 médailles militaires and the cross of the Légion d'honneur, yet his heart still beat with the pride of a simple fusilier. In retirement, Jean lived quietly in Tours, still wearing his old uniform, his medals neatly pinned. He was frail in body, but firm in spirit. Visitors came to see him, young soldiers, officers, even foreign travelers, to marvel at the man who had given 75 years of service to France. Accounts describe him as humble and reserved. He did not boast of battles or wounds. Instead, he often repeated a simple sentiment: "I have always done my duty." For Napoleon, Thurel was a symbol that the Grande Armée could hold up to inspire new generations. Even as the emperor waged wars across Europe, he never forgot to honor this centenarian soldier, proof that the lifeblood of France was carried in its common infantrymen. On March 10, 1807, Jean Thurel passed away in Tours at the extraordinary age of 108. He had lived through 10 decades of war, service, and loyalty. His death was widely reported. Newspapers across France carried the story, "The oldest soldier of Europe is gone. He served faithfully for 75 years and died as he lived a fusilier of Touraine." The news resonated far beyond Tours. For veterans, he was the ultimate comrade. For civilians, he was the embodiment of endurance. For Napoleon's army, he was an eternal standard of loyalty. Jean Thurel's legacy is singular. He was a soldier who never rose above the rank of private, yet kings and emperors honored him. He was wounded multiple times, lost brothers in war, and endured decades of hardship, yet never faltered in duty. He lived long enough to fight for the Bourbon monarchy and be decorated by Napoleon himself. Even today, historians cite him as the oldest recorded soldier in European history, a man whose service stretched across nearly a century. One officer who knew him in Tours later wrote, "When we looked upon old Thurel, we did not see medals or uniforms. We saw the very soul of France. He was not brilliant like a general, nor ambitious like a marshal. He was simply faithful, and that, perhaps, is the highest honor a soldier can achieve." Jean Thurel died as he had lived with modesty, dignity, and the quiet pride of a soldier who never abandoned his post. His story reminds us that history is not only written by emperors and generals, but also by the common men who stand unflinching in the ranks, year after year, war after war. Jean Thurel, the fusilier who spanned centuries. From Louis XIV to Napoleon, from musket to empire, he remained what he had always been, a soldier of France.